allow me to rip the Band-Aid right off. I'm skipping Zelda 2. Every reason you may think why I am skipping it is exactly the reason why I am skipping over that title. I know there are some of you who enjoy this type of game. Masochists. I jest. There are redeeming qualities in Zelda 2, The Adventures of Link, or Link's Adventure, I forget the subtitle of it. Anyway, the swordplay is innovative for its time, but it's also, how to put this delicately, clunky.
It's a steaming pile of hot monkey poo garbage.
Oh, hello there, what was that? I thought I buried that painful subconscious a long time ago.
I'm back. You're worthless.
Oh.
Your wife hates you.
No, she doesn't. She loves me. She got me this tie for Father's Day.
You're half the man of others. Your family would be better off without you. And your children would be happier calling a better man Dad.
Whoa. Ouch. Oh, okay. Time to drink you back into oblivion. Retrospective is brought to you by the following virtual therapy services. Not actually sponsored, this is only a bit. Do not turn to alcohol to solve your mental anguish. Please seek real help. In the long run, Zelda 2's contribution to the franchise is minimal. I'm not saying the game is unimportant, it's actually very important. Kind of important. Somewhat important. It's got its redeeming qualities and a dedicated fan base, okay? I am not diminishing that, it's just not prudent to discuss this game at this time. We will come back to its redeeming qualities when we discuss Ocarina of Time. Ow! I get it! You like Zelda 2. The fact is, Zelda games are about fun, with a capital F. And I don't mean the subjective form of fun, like how some people enjoy playing Frisbee and others enjoy stamp collecting. No judgment. And I get fun is always still subjective, but I think you'll get where I'm going with this point. The fun I am talking about is a feeling. The totality of the work of something. Everything about it is just fun. Like how Chuck E. Cheese is a fun atmosphere. If you're 7. Or better yet, think of a fun person. Like Ronald McDonald. He just seems like a fun guy no matter the occasion. Fun is in his DNA. Even if you don't like him or are terribly afraid of clowns. As for Zelda 2, I mean, he's nice, I guess.
F is for friends who do stuff together. U is for you and me. N is for anywhere and anytime at all.
Down here in the deep blue sea.
F is for fire that burns down the whole town, used for uranium bombs. N is for no survivors when you...
Plankton.
(1992). The 90s had arrived. By 1992, Nickelodeon was cranking out The Adventures of Pete and Pete, Fox Kids started airing Batman the Animated Series, Friday nights were for TGIF on ABC, and the console war was raging. It was Sega versus Nintendo in the fight of the decade. And with a 2-year head start, Sega was giving Nintendo a run for their money, mainly thanks to one Tom Kalinske. In 1990, Tom Kalinske was approached to be the head of Sega of America and was tasked with taking down the Big N. His approach was a no-holds-barred, bare-knuckle marketing brawl. He approved aggressive pricing, daring campaign, and edgy ads with attitude. He went straight for the jugular. He treated this marketing blitz as a political campaign. They didn't just advertise their own products, they attacked Nintendo viciously. They would do anything that showed Nintendo as old and rusty, while in contrast showing Sega as new, fresh, and exciting. By 1992, the Super Nintendo had been on the market for a full year in the US, while Sega had the Genesis on the market since '89. Nintendo now had their answer to the Genesis and was able to go toe-to-toe against Sega and its edgy aura. And that aura was working. Sega was taking large chunks out of Nintendo's market lead. Nintendo was a family-friendly brand of yore, and Sega represented the spirit of the 90s. Gen X was growing up, and millennials were entering the scene. The Super Nintendo launched in 1991 with Super Mario World, which was more Mario. Sega, at the end of 1991, introduced Sonic, and Sonic was everything that Mario wasn't. He was fast, he was cool, he liked chili dogs for some reason. Sonic was epic and transformative, while Super Mario World appeared to be more iterative than innovative. Appeared is the key word here. Go ahead and click the banner and check out my Super Mario World retrospective if you haven't already. I'll wait. Sega's tactics were taking a bite out of Nintendo's lunch. Sega was leading the way for the 16-bit era. At the end of 1992 in North America, Sega had sold a total of 7.6 million Genesises to Nintendo's 6.9 million SNESs. How do you pluralize these? This is hard. English is tricky. Anyway, this was largely thanks to their 2-year head start. But while Sega did have that lead on total lifetime sales, the SNES did outsell the Genesis in 1992. Barely. 4.9 million to 4.5 million. Plus, Nintendo was still dominating the video game market as a whole by taking a whopping 80% of the total revenue spent on video games that year. $4.29 billion out of a total of $5.3 billion. This was largely in thanks to the newish Game Boy and the NES that was still performing pretty strongly in the market. But winning the 16-bit console generation was really important. Nintendo could solely rely on their legacy product for only a short time. They needed to grow with the competition. All in all, at the end of the 16-bit console war, Nintendo would still come out the winner worldwide by outselling the Genesis by almost 20 million units. Back to 1992, this year was a different story. Nintendo needed the next big thing. Super Mario World had its hooks in people, but they needed to show what the Super Nintendo could really offer up. Nintendo wanted to prove that while they could be challenged, they couldn't be beaten. In 1989, Nintendo was being assaulted on 2 fronts. On one side, they had Sega with the Genesis/Master Drive, and on the other, NEC Home Entertainment had also released a TurboGrafx 16/PC engine, depending which area of the world you lived in. Nintendo needed to step up. That year, they internally announced the development of a successor to the NES/Famicom. Some of the current projects would be switched from NES titles to SNES titles, 2 of which were Super Mario Bros. 4 and Zelda 3. Miyamoto and his team switched gears to develop for the updated hardware and went into experimentation mode on what could and could not be done on the new 16-bit console. Like the original Super Mario Bros. And Legend of Zelda titles, the new SNES Mario and Zelda projects would be developed in tandem, though this time Miyamoto would focus on being director of only the Super Mario World game, while Takashi Tezuka would take over as being the director for the new Zelda title for the SNES. Now, the goal was to have both games ready at launch. This would showcase the new hardware with new entries for 2 of Nintendo's most popular franchises that would feature updated graphics and gameplay only possible on the Super Nintendo. Unfortunately, this proved to be more than they could handle. Being the face of Nintendo, Super Mario World was chosen to take priority to finish in time for launch. Zelda would have to wait an extra year, and it would take advantage of that extra development time. Like the original Zelda, Zelda 3 had a lot of ambitions. Originally, the team wanted to be able to have 3 parallel worlds for Link to travel between. They wanted bushes to be set on fire and then spread to create giant brush fires. They wanted you to be able to dig trenches and reroute waterways. They wanted a systems-first game design 25 years before they would create a systems-first Zelda game. Unfortunately, they needed to wrap up development to get the game shipped and out the door. Miyamoto was confident, though, that if the team just had 6 more months, they could have accomplished some of those features. But what they did accomplish was monumental. It released in 1991 in Japan under the title Super Famicom Legend of Zelda Triforce of the Gods. The game released in America a year later. The name was changed to The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. This was done because of Nintendo of America's strict ban on religious references in their games. Even some icons in the game were changed to maintain that rule, even if it wasn't intentionally meant to be a religious reference. A Link to the Past would undo everything Zelda 2 did on the NES, with the exception of some element of the swordplay mechanics. It would go back to the basic gameplay of The Legend of Zelda, but with more. There'd be more secrets, more items, more weapons. There'd be more to explore, more to do, more to experience. Whatever The Legend of Zelda did, A Link to the Past would do bigger, better, and more. But the game was also made more accessible than The Legend of Zelda was. While venturing forth and exploring on your own was highly encouraged, key story locations and dungeon locations were marked on your map. They didn't always give away how you were to reach or open said dungeons, but at least you had a general direction you knew you had to head to. The rest, you were left up to your own devices to figure out. The new hardware would be used to add special effects that would create drama and depth to the setting. At the start of the game, you can hear the sound of rain pelting Link's house. And when you enter the castle during this opening sequence, you'll hear the rain pouring on the roof here as well. The Lost Woods would be covered in a dense fog, creating mystery and unease. And after you get the Master Sword, the fog lifts, but you still see the shadow of the trees, showing that this is a dense forest. Some enemies would shock you when hit, and the whole screen would pixelate to simulate the shock Link was getting. The same pixelation effect would be used to transition from the light world to the dark world. The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past was taking full advantage of the new features in the SNES. In addition to these fun new atmospheric enhancements, Link was now able to move in 8 directions as opposed to only 4. This did introduce an issue with the swordplay though. The team had difficulty trying to figure out how Link would thrust his sword on the diagonal axis. No matter what they did, it just never looked or felt right. So while Link could travel in 8 directions, the sprite could still only face the cardinal 4. This created a problem of how Link would attack diagonally. Instead of simply thrusting his sword forward like he did in The Legend of Zelda, the team made the sword swipe in an arcing motion. This enabled a basic form of swordplay. You now had to position Link around the weak points of some enemies to make sure you didn't hit their sword or shield. Hey, some of that swordplay mechanic from Zelda 2 did show up in this one. What do you know? It is kinda somewhat sorta important. Ow! Sorry! But to be able to strike diagonally, Link was given an extra move. If you held down the attack button, Link would hold his sword out to charge up a spin attack, enabling him to attack the diagonal angles, solving the team's diagonal attack problem. This charge move would become a Zelda staple, and also would come into play in later dungeons of the game when Link would get his final shield upgrade. In order to progress in certain areas, you had to block these laser beams with your new mirror shield. If they're coming from the side, you could hold down the attack button, so while Link's sword was held out, his shield would be up to the side, blocking these side attacks. It's a pretty clever alternative use of the spin attack. The SNES controller also added more buttons, which added more moves to Link's repertoire. There's still a dedicated button to attack and a dedicated button to item usage, but now you could press X to bring up the map at any time, and the A button became a context-sensitive action button. Hold A down and you could dash across the map if you had the Pegasus boots. Stand in front of a sign and press A to read it. Stand next to a sign, press and hold A for a minute to lift, and then press A again to throw that sign. Or to throw anything else you were able to pick up, like jars. Also, breakable jars became a Zelda staple in this game. Press A to talk to an NPC. Hold A and then use a D-pad to push or pull objects or push or pull switches. So the context-sensitive action button became a staple here as well. With the power of the SNES, Miyamoto could now realize some of his original visions from The Legend of Zelda. In the first game, there was this pond that you had to drain the water from to reveal the entrance to a dungeon. The problem is, they couldn't animate the water draining because of hardware constraints. But with the SNES, that could now be accomplished. Also, with the parallel worlds mechanic, you could have actions in one world affect the layout of another, which created interesting and new puzzle mechanics. Well, at least one time. Some of the original ideas Miyamoto had envisioned for his great medieval quest could now be realized. A Link to the Past was more Zelda on steroids. Super Mario Bros. Laid the foundational basics for Mario, and Super Mario Bros. 3 defined what a Mario game is. Likewise, The Legend of Zelda laid the same foundational basics for a Zelda game, while A Link to the Past, Zelda's third game, would define what makes a Zelda game a Zelda game. Just about every Zelda title that will come after A Link to the Past will follow the path that this game had forged, for better or for worse. So let's take a look at 3 key elements that A Link to the Past defined. The Overworld. In the original Legend of Zelda, the Overworld was kind of an afterthought. The game was more focused on the dungeon design. But once they added the Overworld with its focus on exploration, it was ripe for a significant upgrade. A Link to the Past saw the land of Hyrule expand significantly. Key elements for the original were reimagined and expanded on. The Lost Woods went from a puzzle element to a mysterious and creepy location. Death Mountain was now an actual mountain you could climb and not just a pile of rocks to bomb. There's now a castle in the center of Hyrule that would become the focal point of the map, and would become the focal point of just about every Zelda map from here on out. A Link to the Past would still focus on a level-by-level type linear progression with the dungeons, but the overworld this time would be full of more life and better telegraphed secrets. Areas of Hyrule didn't all look the same. It felt like a fully lived-in world. But this game didn't just have one overworld, it had 2. There was the Light World and the Dark World. To save on system memory, a lot of the overworld design was the same with a simple color palette swap to differentiate. But some areas and obstacles and placements were different enough that the Dark World felt both similar and completely alien at the same time. This idea of dueling worlds would become a standard Zelda motif. It'd be used again in Ocarina of Time, Oracle of Seasons and Ages, and of course, the direct sequel to Link of the Past, A Link Between Worlds. Both of these worlds would be filled with fun and adventure. The land of Hyrule became a fully realized place, with deserts, lakes, mountains, and forests. There were more details in the design and art. There were friends to find and strange new creatures who would give you gifts. The world wasn't just a place to explore, but a land to be experienced. The dungeons. The Legend of Zelda's dungeons were labyrinths in their design. They weren't really puzzles to solve, and they were all very similar looking to each other. Nothing made any dungeon really stand out from the others. Except this one. Similar symbols in different cultures can come to represent wildly different things. A Link to the Past now gave a theme and motif to the dungeons. There were temples, caves, towers, and castles. It wasn't just simply finding keys to unlock doors to progress through the dungeon. There were also puzzles to solve. What you do in one room could affect the layout of another, thereby progressing Link through the dungeon. The opening of the game acts as a great tutorial for how dungeons in this game will work. When you wake up, you'll first want to open the chest in your house, which contains the lantern. You then make your way to Hyrule Castle, where the path guides you to this bush. Pick it up, and you fall down the pit. We immediately learn that pits like this on the overworld are not dangerous. They are secret entrances. We get the sword and shield from our uncle, and then make our way to the bowels of the castle. The first room we enter once under the castle has a locked door, a blue knight, and a treasure chest. Defeating the knight grants us a key, and the chest contains a map of the dungeon. We can now open that door and also see the rest of the rooms in the dungeon. We then enter a large area with multiple levels and pits. We can either go down the stairs or just jump off the ledge, teaching us how multi-levels work. We also learn that when we strike a knight, we knock them back, and we can send them off the ledge into the pit. So these pits are deadly to Link and his enemies. And also some obstacles can be used to our advantage. We have these knights patrolling this area with barriers, which teaches us how barriers affect enemy behavior and detection. And if we so choose, we could completely skip those knights by going up to the top layer and crossing a bridge and coming down the other side, not having to worry about fighting them then. We're going to see elements of choice in dungeons and how we approach situations. The next room we enter, we get locked in. The door ahead is locked, and the other 2 doors close. They only open once we defeat the enemy, showing us some rooms will lock us in until we defeat all the enemies inside. This knight will not drop a key, so we can't open that locked door. We'll have to explore the door to our right, teaching us we sometimes have to go out of our way to progress forward. The next room we defeat the Blue Knight, get a key, and open a chest to find a new item, the Boomerang. The next enemy we encounter is a knight in the dungeon. We may be tempted to use our new Boomerang to see what it does. It doesn't hurt him, but it does stun him for a moment, so we can kill him without fear of him retaliating. This comes in handy when fighting the knight with the mace. You can stun him, go in, get a few swipes, and then get out before he starts swinging the mace again. After rescuing Zelda, we have to push this block in the throne room, showing that some paths have obstacles that need to be pushed aside to be revealed. We venture through the sewers where we use a lantern to light unlit torches, and it ends with us having to pull a switch. In all this, we learn the basics of how the dungeons will work, how enemies work, how to explore, and how to push and pull and pick things up. We also learn not all key items for a dungeon will be found in the dungeon. They'll be found in the overworld before we even enter the dungeon. If you don't get that lantern, you're not going to do well in the sewers. These won't be your NES Zelda dungeons, that is for sure. The dungeons became more puzzle-focused and less of an obstacle-focused labyrinthian gauntlet. And these dungeons also became real places. Despite the fact that the game was still a 2D game, the team treated these dungeons as three-dimensional spaces. In the Tower of Hera, in order to get the dungeon's item, the Moon Pearl, you had to fall down this hole in the floor above in order to reach the chest. So you had to understand how the dungeon would be laid out in 3D space. And for the Skull Woods dungeon, you have to exit back into the overworld to find other entrances and pits, some hidden, to fall into other areas of the dungeon in order to progress. The designers were able to craft dungeons in a 2D space with a 3D feel. The dungeons were now themed, more complex, more realized, and just more fun than they were before. Completing one had a different feeling of accomplishment. You didn't just feel skilled or strong, you felt smart at solving the puzzles that lay within it. The items. Items take a little more necessary role this time around in completing dungeons. Items like the bow and arrow, hookshot, hammer, and fire rod are found as a treasure item in Eastern Palace of the Light World and 3 of the dungeons in the Dark World. They're also needed to progress and complete the dungeon they are found in. And the hookshot and hammer open up parts of the world that were previously unreachable. Most items will be found by exploring the overworld though, and quite a few of them will be needed to venture to the next dungeon, like the Book of Madura and the Quake and Ether medallions, and the Zora flippers. And the more you explore the overworld, the more items you can find that aid you on your quest, like the bag of magic powder that can turn anti-fairies into normal fairies, or these slime guys into Groucho Marx guys. You'll find bottles to keep potions and fairies in, the bug catching net to catch fairies to keep in the bottles, the ice rod, magic cape, cane of Berna, Zora flippers, blue mail, sword upgrades, bomb upgrades, bow upgrades, all are found the more you explore the overworld. And some items, like the cane of Berna, make defeating dungeon bosses a lot easier. If you thought there was a lot to find in The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past has a ton of extra items and equipment to find, and this time around, the items and equipment are a bit more Metroid-esque. Acquiring them opens up more of the world to explore like it did in Metroid. What's interesting is how the world opens up. Once you finish the tutorial dungeon in the Light World, most of the Light World is open for you to explore. The only places you can't reach are Death Mountain, the Zora Waterfall, and this island in the middle of the lake. But once you get the Power Glove from the Desert Palace, you can now reach Death Mountain, where the Tower of Hera, the third and final dungeon in the Light World is, and the Zora Waterfall, where you can get the flippers to reach this island in the lake. Now, only one area of Death Mountain is the only region of Hyrule you can't yet reach. The Dark World is designed the opposite way. You are walled off to the small corner of the map. Once you get the hammer from the Dark Palace, the first dungeon in the Dark World, does the Dark World map really open up. Almost the whole of both maps are fully open to you, and now in the Light World you can reach warp points that lead you to different areas of the Dark World. It has some echoes of the Metroid world progression design. Now, the full realization of how Zelda items will work is not completely established in A Link to the Past. Only a handful of dungeons absolutely require the key item to finish the dungeon and defeat the dungeon's boss, like the bow and arrow in the Eastern Palace, the magic hammer in the Dark Palace, and the hookshot in Swamp Palace. What's interesting is in Misery Mire, you get the Cane of Samaria, which is needed at only one point in the dungeon to create a block to push the switch down. The item actually becomes a necessity in the next dungeon, Turtle Rock, which it would have made more sense to have that item there, but I digress. That part of the formula will be perfected in the next Zelda game, Link's Awakening. A quick aside and some stray thoughts before we move on. A Link to the Past would also begin the separated structure that most Zelda games would follow. A set of intro dungeons, an interlude, and a second half of more challenging dungeons. Ocarina of Time would follow this, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, kinda, Skyward Sword, and A Link Between Worlds would all take cues from this kind of formula. Now, all of these aesthetical and mechanical features are all well and good. They are the defining features of what makes a Zelda game a Zelda game. But there is something else that A Link to the Past establishes that puts the cherry on top of the Zelda game definition this game establishes. The overall vibe for A Link to the Past is fun, with a capital F. Not only did this game establish the key dungeon ideas, standard archetypal Zelda weapons, and a fleshed out lived-in world and lore, it also established the overall vibe that would encapsulate Zelda games from here on out. I like to call Zelda the Star Wars of video games. I know there are Star Wars video games, so just give me a minute to explain what I mean here. Within each of the trilogies of Star Wars, the main hero comes from humble beginnings, has an overly positive and sometimes enthusiastic view of the world, and overcomes severe obstacles to defeat evil and restore peace to a galaxy in turmoil. Or, become evil and the main bad guy. Anyway, Star Wars is a small-scale story that takes place in a fleshed-out, large-scaled world. It also doesn't take itself too seriously. There are quirky characters and humor sprinkled throughout all of the films, and it doesn't shy away from silliness. It actually fully embraces it at times. The story can quickly become dark and brooding, covering harsh events that show evil is real and is a threat. For the most part, these moments are balanced pretty well, except for Jar Jar. Star Wars is fun through and through. It has action, drama, romance, and can be quirky. Zelda is the same way. It's a small story taking place amongst big events. A boy awakens to save a princess. But the stakes are actually higher than that. The whole world is at stake, and it's also filled with memorable characters and even silly moments. Like this middle-aged man, or the bat that curses you with an upgraded magic meter. But as quickly as it can embrace the silliness, Zelda can also embrace dark, harsh realities. A father missing his son who disappeared. A boy falsely accused of regicide.
You have selected regicide. If you know the name of the king or queen being murdered, press 1.
Zelda has a small story with big stakes, but its embrace of silliness gives it its quirky Zelda feel. It made the game fun and amusing, but at the same time that silliness was always done in a way that never distracted from the epic story it was trying to tell. Instead, it became part of Zelda's charm. The quirky moments are something that future Zelda games will continue to lean into, but they're always done in a way that adds to the overall motif of the game. It doesn't take away from the darker, more brooding moments. In contrast, it makes those moments stand out all the more, and it all works together to form a cohesive, fun product. A Link to the Past may be the third Zelda game, but it's the first one to define what the core experiences of Zelda will be. The dungeon formats, the lore and story, the Master Sword, the sages, Ganon's origins are introduced. The items, the world, the quirkiness, everything we know and love about Zelda started with this game and has been iterated on from here. But most importantly, this game made Zelda fun.